I love when y'all add on to the information because this is absolutely correct. When the U.S. built highways in the 20th century, many of them ran through black neighborhoods. So Congress's Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 started this, authorizing the largest public works program in the U.S. It promised to construct 41,000 miles of an interstate highway system that would crisscross the nation. But the expansion, which happened between the late 1950s through the early 1970s, also came at the cost of destroying black neighborhoods. After the passage of the 1956 highway bill, the expansion of I-95, for example, went through Miami and led to the destruction of 87 acres of housing and commercial property in the Overtown community. Now, Overtown is one of those thousands of black communities that prospered we don't hear much about. Comprised of predominantly African Americans, the city of Overtown is the second oldest Miami neighborhood dating back to 1896. So what happened was when blacks from the South and the Bahamas came to work on railroads around Miami, they weren't allowed to mingle with the locals. You wasn't going to Miami Beach resorts, none of that. But you were segregated in an area they called Colored Town, which is Overtown. Overtown took off, as we usually do. We became successful. Cultural development mirrored the awakening of the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s and 1930s, gaining Overtown the nickname the Harlem of the South. But despite Overtown's popularity, the I-95, I-395, and SR-836 construction forced locals to move out and abandon the city. According to Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, only 8,000 of an estimated 40,000 remained in Overtown after the highway expansion. So blocked from moving into white neighborhoods, displaced residents were forced to crowd into nearby sections of the city already struggling with poverty and decay. And what happened to Overtown also happened to Black Wall Street. Remember, as we discussed in a previous video, it wasn't the massacre of 1921 that ultimately destroyed Greenwood because Greenwood was rebuilt. It was integration and Interstate 244 in the 1970s, which ran right through the heart of Greenwood, destroying the Dreamland Theater, along with the hundreds of homes and businesses they had rebuilt, which got bulldozed and all of those things. In Atlanta, according to Princeton University historian Kevin Cruz, I-20 was designed to serve as a boundary between the black and white communities. Roughly 60,000 whites left Atlanta for the suburbs in the 1960s and another 100,000 in the 1970s. In Chicago, Robert Taylor was built at the same time, interestingly enough, as the Dan Ryan. They were both built around 1962. The 14-lane expressway kept the projects, comprised mostly of African Americans by the 1960s, on one side and white communities they didn't want us in on the other.
This is Robert Taylor Homes, the largest housing project in the world, the poorest urban community in the United States.
In 1987, a documentary aired on TV called Crisis on Federal Street. In addition to saying it was the poorest urban community in the U.S., the host also mentioned Robert Taylor as being, quote, an attempt by the city government to constrain the black population of the city at that time to the smallest geographical area. Also, Robert Taylor was built on top of the State Street slums. Before the high-rises, before what we know as the projects, a lot of black people migrating to northern cities lived in slums, and the projects was built on top of the slums. But we will come back to Robert Taylor in a separate video. There is a lot to unpack. We need to talk about the man that the projects was named after, and I can also give personal accounts of what it was like having lived there. In summary, according to the U.S. Department of Transportation estimates, federal roadway construction displaced more than 475,000 households and more than 1 million people nationwide. And the neighborhoods destroyed and families uprooted by highway projects were predominantly black and poor.